When we think of climate science, we tend to think about a diverse group of scientists working in international laboratories. We're thinking about vegan Tesla drivers. We're thinking about militant socialist activists. And we think about these bureaucrats of the United Nations and the IPCC who work for the world and not for any particular country. But if you look behind this marketing, you will actually find that climate science is very much dominated by the Anglo-Americans, and it is very much dominated by the military. Especially the military background is something you will not hear from any side of the arguments about the climate. Now, everybody knows at this point that the industry, especially oil, gas, and coal, they financed publications, they financed programs, they financed politicians to say that there is no global warming. And of course, the conflict of interest immediately makes it sound very dubious. But interestingly, these industry-funded people, they never really talk about the military background of climate science. We see this background with the UK Met Office. We see it with the Hadley Center for Climate Prediction. We see it with the Climatic Research Unit, NOAA, and NASA. So where does this main climate prediction actually come from? The most important calculations are run on an American supercomputer in the British Met Office, which is basically the military. And the company that makes those supercomputers is based on American military intelligence. The results of these calculations are then just handed over to the IPCC. The leading author of the first three main IPCC reports was the Nobel Sir John Theodore Houghton. He was also the leader of the UK Met Office and the founder of the Hadley Center. In the year 2000, Sir Houghton became a trustee of the Shell Foundation, which is separate from the Shell Oil Corporation, but not that separate. And of course, the oil corporation goes back to the higher levels of nobility. So, the Anglo-Americans control the tools, the main tools of data gathering and data processing. These big reports of the IPCC are supposed to reflect global science. Now, of course, other countries have climate scientists too, and they also have cray supercomputers, and they also use software, but this is in no way comparable to the software used by the Anglo-Americans. The consensus we hear is almost 100%, and that is supposed to give us a goal as a society. It's supposed to give us meaning. The highest CO2 emitting industries make products such as artificial fertilizer or concrete, fossil fuels, of course. And these things are relatively easy to make. A lot of patents have run out, and even small companies could actually produce cheap products that work. In the future, however, only climate-neutral products will be allowed on any grand scale. And so corporations are finding ways to attract investors and to make very complex products that are climate neutral. And these products are supposed to be not more expensive than the former normal products. That is the big promise. But the only players who can afford the scientists, who can afford these new patents, the only corporations who can actually thrive in this future are very, very large corporations. And of course, we're talking American corporations, and we're talking British corporations, and Russian corporations, and Chinese corporations. It's very simple to burn traditional gas or coal, but it's very, very difficult to create energy through fusion or to make a climate-neutral liquid fuel. Even some people on the political left are now smelling that this is very, very suspicious. For example, we have the filmmaker Michael Moore, who is, of course, well known for covering all sorts of topics, such as vote fraud, such as the health system, and so on and so forth. A lot of people probably expected him to make a climate film in his usual style. Very aggressive, very funny, somewhat manipulative, but this movie never came. It took until 2019 when Michael Moore produced a film about the climate crisis. It's called Planet of the Humans, and the director is Jeff Gibbs, who has a completely different style from Michael Moore. It's very drab, it's kind of boring. And this movie was posted for free on YouTube, and it only hit around 11 million views. So this is a fraction of what a music video would actually do. So why was it, relatively speaking, a flop? Well, because the movie criticized the climate transformation as it is happening now and how it was proceeding over the last couple of years. So you see the same large corporations actually transitioning and buying their way into the future. Some people from the Green Movement even accused Michael Moore of being a traitor, of having gone over to the dark side, of having defected, and now working for the evil industry. To be clear, Michael Moore really believes in climate change the way it is presented to us by the IPCC. Why didn't he actually explain the military background of climate science and how all these different entities connected to climate science are basically military, such as NASA or NOAA? Not even right-wing influencers mention or explain the military background of climate science, especially not the industry-funded people. Weather and climate are so important for military purposes that a lot about the science is very, very secret. For example, it was a weather expert who led to the success of Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Normandy in World War II. So in 1944, the Anglo-Americans, they needed acceptable weather for over 150,000 troops, 7,000 boats, and the fighter planes. It took months to discern what the weather is going to be, when the clouds are going to be right, when the moon is going to be right. And it was a certain day that was chosen for the invasion. And then at the last minute, this date had to be postponed. It was changed by around 1 day. So US General Eisenhower was convinced that it would be prudent to wait another day and this would actually work. And it actually indeed worked out. Before the invasion, you saw an actual weather war. The fighting was about weather data and weather stations. So the Nazis used all of their capabilities to deploy airplanes with sensors and to deploy ships with sensors and to have stations on islands around the Atlantic Ocean. The Anglos tried to destroy as many German weather stations as possible because it was of the utmost importance to have the best weather data and to keep the enemy from attaining the best possible weather data. The leading meteorologist for the Anglos was the British Captain James Stagg. He was a member of the Royal Air Force, and he was honored with some of the highest orders of the British colonial empire. And he also became a member of the aristocratic run scientific organization, the Royal Society. The Americans gave Captain James Stagg the Military Legion of Merit Order. He became president of the British Royal Meteorological Society, and he also became a director at the British Meteorological Office, also called Met Office, which later hosted the working group of the United Nations Climate Science Unit, the IPCC. And there's also the Hadley Center for Climate Prediction at this Met Office. In 2001, the IPCC working group moved to America and went to NOAA, which is investigating or surveilling the atmosphere and the oceans, which of course has a very important military meaning. The UK Met Office afforded a lot of the world's leading supercomputers. They had a bunch of Crays, IBMs, and NACs. And nowadays, the Met Office owns 3 Cray XC40 computers that have 460,000 processor cores. After World War I, the Met Office became part of the Air Ministry, which was concerned with the Royal Air Force. In 1990, the Met Office was attached to the Ministry of Defense. And then in 2011, right around the time when climate change became a thing in scientific circles, the Met Office was separated from the Ministry of Defense, at least on paper. But of course, the old ties still continued. The Met Office has some of its offices and its weather stations on property of the Royal Air Force. The first 5 directors of the Met Office were all fellows of the Royal Society, the leading scientific organization, and they all received aristocratic titles. We had Sir William Napier Shaw, fellow Royal Society, president of the Royal Meteorological Society, actually became a knight through King George V. Then we had Sir Graham Sutton, fellow of the Royal Society, president of the Royal Meteorological Society, also became a knight. He also worked at the infamous unit Porton Down. He was working on biological weapons and chemical weapons in relation to the weather. They actually had a plan to attack Nazi Germany with a lot of anthrax. Then we had Sir Basil John Mason. He was serving in the radar unit of the British Royal Air Force, became a fellow of the Royal Society, president of the Royal Meteorological Society, and also became a knight. Then we had Sir John Theodore Houghton. He became one of the leaders of the working group of the IPCC. He's also the lead author of the first 3 IPCC reports. He shared the Nobel Prize with Al Gore. He is also honorary scientist of the Hadley Center and a founder of the Hadley Center, fellow of the Royal Society, and president of the Royal Meteorological Society. Then we had Julian Charles Rowland Hunt, Baron Hunt of Chesterton, professor for climate modeling at the Department of Space and Climate Physics and Department of Earth Sciences, University College London, also fellow of the Royal Society. In the year 2000, Sir Houghton became a trustee of the foundation of the Shell Oil Corporation. Now, it was said that the foundation was separate from the actual oil company, but not that separate. So the Hadley Center developed a climate model called Hadjam. Now, this is a piece of software which is supposed to simulate Earth and its climate. In the beginning, the modeling was quite primitive. They did not really understand the oceans yet. Most of the global warming is supposed to be absorbed in the oceans. The famous Climatic Research Unit initially got its funding through British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, and Exxon, or let's say the Rockefeller Foundation. The Climatic Research Unit is hosted at the University of East Anglia, and its directors are very much connected people. For example, Baron Oliver Franks was decorated with some of the highest orders of the British colonial empire. He was a member of the Privy Council, and he was also a deputy lieutenant of the Crown. He has been described as one of the founders of the post-war era. He became famous for his organization skills during World War II, when the task was to replace all the military hardware that had been left behind at Dunkirk when British troops were evacuated. He was also one of the architects of NATO. He was a member of the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group. He was in a leading position at the Rhodes Trust and the Rockefeller Foundation. Cecil John Rhodes was a member of the Privy Council, and he was a very big fan of British imperialism. In 1972, the University of East Anglia started the Climatic Research Unit, and the project was pushed forward by the nobleman Sir Graham Sutton, member of the Royal Society, who researched at the infamous Porton Down facility. He was tasked with biological and chemical weapons. The plan was to attack Nazi Germany with anthrax, and there was an actual test run of this mission in 1940 and 1941 on the small island Grenard near Scotland. All the sheep died. The test run was regarded as a big success, and the island was under quarantine up until 1990. In the fall of 1944, Operation Vegetarian, yes, that was the name of the operation, was ready to roll, but instead a different approach was chosen, which was, of course, Operation Overlord, the storming of the Normandy beaches. A lot of people don't realize the military background of NASA. It's supposed to be a civil organization to explore deep space, but it sort of has become a tool for climate science over the last couple of years. Exploring deep space is very interesting and very expensive, and it does not benefit the military that much. And so, even in the 1970s, the United States Congress had sort of lost interest in deep space exploration and tried to find new reasons for NASA to exist. The new roadmap was called the Earth Observing System. In the year 2007, NASA had 17 different missions running with its own satellites to observe the climate. In 1972, legendary investigative reporter Seymour Hersh exposed an interesting operation in the New York Times. It was called Operation Popeye, and it concerned weather weapons during the Vietnam War. Some crucial experimentation had been done beforehand, under the disguise of improving weather conditions for the farms. It is sort of a dual-use technology. You can use it for peaceful purposes, you can avoid droughts, you can avoid rainstorms, and so on and so forth. But the more you use these tools, the better you understand how to use them in an offensive war context. Now, whenever some big operation gets exposed, the reaction is always kind of the same. It is claimed the operation was a failure, that it was small to begin with, and that the operation has been stopped. In 1996, the United States Air Force called for a global system of weather surveillance for military purposes. Only 3 years later, we saw the publication of the infamous hockey stick study, which proposed there was catastrophic global warming coming and we need a lot more surveillance of the global climate. This US Air Force document from 1996 talks about all kinds of war contexts for climate science. So for example, you want to give the enemy worse weather. You want to provide better conditions for your own troops. You want to spoof the enemy's sensors so they can't get honest readings on the temperatures and the humidity and any other relevant data. You do not want the enemy or the potential enemies to understand the actual weather and climate. Weather modification was supposed to become the standard for any important military operation, not just some special thing that you could do every once in a while. And still, we are asked to believe that we as citizens and as normal scientists, we are privy to actual accurate weather and climate information. Now, there is a convention, an international convention against weather weapons. It's called NMOD. Pretty soon after the exposure of Operation Popeye through Seymour Hersh, we saw this new treaty. The problem with this treaty is there is no mechanism in it to actually see what countries adhere to the treaty. There are not even provisions about punishing anybody for developing weather weapons. But you may ask, what about the scientific consensus on global warming? Didn't we hear that 97% or so of all climate scientists agree that the IPCC is correct? Now, the proper way of finding out what the scientists were thinking would have been this. You assemble a list of 1,000, 10,000, 50,000 relevant climate scientists. You employ standard practices of opinion research. Every participant is supposed to answer the same question, how much they agree or disagree with any given statement. When you do it like this, you get realistic results. The climate scientists do not have a grand trust in these computer models. So where does this 97% consensus number come from? A number of studies have been done in a very flawed way. The basic procedure is this. You use a search engine with a database of all kinds of scientific studies, sometimes not even related to climate science. Some of them are loosely attached to climate science. Some only briefly mention the IPCC or use the term climate change. You search for words such as climate change, and then you get thousands and thousands of results. But you don't even have the time to read 10,000 or 15,000 studies. No, you only read the short excerpts, and then you determine whether or not this excerpt is pro-global warming or anti-global warming. And then you just count everything pretty much as confirming the global warming consensus. If you want to program a computer model of the world and its climate, and this is supposed to be an accurate model, it's supposed to be able to calculate 100 years into the future. If you want to achieve that, you need almost perfection. The data going in has to be almost perfect. All those complicated weather and climate mechanisms have to be understood in a perfect way. And they have to be combined in a perfect way. They have to be translated into computer code in a perfect way. It's not good enough to have 99% accuracy or 99.5% accuracy. You need virtually 100% accuracy and perfection in all these different many elements that you then combine, and they have to be combined in exactly the right way. If you are a little bit wrong here and a bit more wrong over there, and you don't combine these things correctly, and the code is not written in a perfect way, then you end up with an inaccurate result of the calculation. You cannot accurately calculate the future up to 1/10 of a degree Celsius. You could be off by 2 degrees Celsius in one direction or the other direction. You could be off even more. Don't listen to political activists. Go and study what leading climate scientists are actually saying about the problems and challenges in their own field or subfield of science. You can look for all kinds of studies online, and you can look for anything that contains the word problem or challenge. There's a lot you can do with satellites. You can measure an object in a very precise manner. This object could be an enemy ship, or it could be an enemy facility of a military kind. But it's not accurate enough to measure how much the oceans are rising. The Argo program is using thousands of buoys and floats to measure the temperatures and other values of the ocean surface and even in the deeper ocean regions. But what are the leading scientists saying about Argo? It's a nice program, but there is flat funding and these floats are just nowhere near enough to understand the oceans. The Earth's climate is ridiculously complicated. There is way too much data. It is impossible to figure out how many miscalculations and errors there are. The latest book by Bill Gates is about the climate science, but it's more of an investment brochure. He is telling you that he and his very rich friends are investing in certain companies that will make the products of the future. Very, very complicated but climate neutral products, which are not supposed to be more expensive than the old products. However, only a few select corporations will be able to make these new products, and the old ones are outlawed.